you believe you think, that every decision you make, every answer you give, every idea you hold comes from you. But pause for a second. If that were true, why do you need to remember everything before you understand anything? Why do you feel lost the moment a question is asked in a slightly different way? Why does your confidence disappear the second the pattern changes? Because what you call thinking isn't thinking, it's recall. You were trained to recognize patterns, repeat information, and follow steps. And over time, that started to feel like intelligence. You solved problems faster. You memorized more. You passed exams. From the outside, it looked like growth. But inside, something was missing. Understanding. Here's the contrast no one tells you. Thinking is slow. It's messy. It forces you to stop and question things that don't immediately make sense. Memorizing is fast, clean, predictable. It gives you the illusion of progress without the discomfort of confusion. And guess which one the system rewards? From the very beginning, you were pushed toward speed. Finish the syllabus. Complete the chapter. Move to the next topic. There was no time to stop and ask, what does this actually mean? There was only time to remember what would be on the test. So you adapted. You stopped asking questions. You started collecting answers. And that shift changed the way your brain works. Instead of building ideas from the ground up, you began stacking information on top of information. Definitions, formulas, steps. You learned how to move forward without ever fully understanding what was behind you. And because everyone around you was doing the same thing, it felt normal. But it isn't. Think about the last time you truly understood something. Not memorized it. Not repeated it. Actually understood it. That moment when everything suddenly made sense. When you could explain it in your own words, see it clearly in your mind, connect it to other ideas. That feeling is rare, not because understanding is hard, but because you were trained to avoid it. You were taught to move on too quickly, to trust the answer instead of questioning it, to believe that if something is written in a textbook, it must already be understood. But here's the truth. You can know something perfectly and still not understand it at all. You can memorize an entire subject and still be unable to think within it. That's the illusion. And once you see it, something starts to feel off. You begin to notice how often people speak confidently without truly understanding what they're saying. How often knowledge is just repetition dressed up as intelligence. And then a more uncomfortable thought appears. If that's true for others, how much of what you know is actually yours? But here's where it gets deeper. This didn't happen by accident. Your brain didn't just randomly start preferring memorization over thinking. It was trained that way. Slowly, quietly, over years, through a system designed to shape how you process information. From the moment you entered school, you were introduced to a pattern. Information was presented as complete, finished, already understood. Your job wasn't to question it. Your job was to accept it, learn it, repeat it. And the faster you could do that, the better you were considered. Think about how you were evaluated, not on how deeply you understood something, but on how accurately you could reproduce it. Exams didn't ask, what do you think is happening? They asked, what is the correct answer? And that difference is everything. Because when your brain is constantly rewarded for giving correct answers, it stops caring about understanding. It starts optimizing for performance. It learns that thinking is slow, risky, unnecessary, and instead it builds shortcuts, patterns, templates. You see a question, you match it to something you've seen before, and you respond. That's not thinking, that's pattern recognition. And over time, this rewires how you approach everything. You begin to trust authority over your own reasoning. If a teacher says it, it must be right. If a textbook writes it, it must be true. You stop asking, does this make sense? And start asking, will this be on the test? That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Because now your curiosity is no longer driving your learning. The system is. Here's the contrast. A child naturally asks why, constantly, relentlessly. They don't accept answers easily. They push, they question, they explore. That's natural thinking. But the system can't operate like that. It needs structure, speed, control. So that curiosity gets replaced, gradually. First, you're told to focus, then to follow instructions, then to stop asking unnecessary questions, and eventually, without realizing it, you stop asking at all. Not because you don't care, because you've learned that questioning has no reward, so your brain adapts again. It becomes efficient at absorbing information without challenging it. It learns how to move forward even when something doesn't fully make sense. It learns how to operate within confusion without stopping to resolve it. And that becomes your normal. You can sit through an entire lesson, understand parts of it, miss other parts, and still move on without noticing the gap. Because the system keeps moving and you've learned to move with it. But here's the problem. Those gaps don't disappear, they stack. One concept built on another, each one slightly unclear, slightly unstable. And over time, that instability grows, until you reach a point where everything feels complicated, not because it is, but because the foundation was never solid. And then you start to believe something that isn't true, that you're just not good at it. But that's not the reality. The reality is your brain was trained to prioritize answers over understanding, to move forward without clarity, to accept instead of question. And the more you follow that pattern, the harder it becomes to break. Because now, thinking deeply doesn't feel natural. It feels wrong. So if your brain was trained this way, what exactly was taken away from you? Not knowledge, not intelligence, a method, a way of thinking so simple that it almost feels obvious once you see it. And yet, it's the one thing you were never consistently taught to use. The method is this. You don't accept anything until you can rebuild it yourself. Not repeat it, not recognize it, rebuild it. This is what Richard Feynman noticed early. He realized that most people could explain things using the right words, the right formulas, the right definitions. But if you strip those away, nothing was left. No real understanding, just language. So he approached learning differently. Whenever he encountered something new, he didn't move forward immediately. He slowed down. He asked himself, if I had to explain this to someone with no background, how would I do it? Not using technical terms, but simple ideas, real images, clear reasoning. And that's where the method begins. You take a concept and you translate it from complex, simple, from abstract, visual, from memorized, non-understood. Here's the contrast. Memorization hides confusion. This method exposes it. When you try to explain something simply, you immediately see where your understanding breaks. The parts that felt clear suddenly become vague. The steps you followed before no longer make sense. And for most people, that's uncomfortable enough to stop. But that discomfort is the signal. It means you're finally thinking. Instead of moving past confusion, you sit with it. You break the idea down further. You ask, what is actually happening here? Not what the formula says, not what the textbook claims. What is happening in reality? If you were watching it, what would you see? That question changes everything, because now you're no longer relying on external explanations. You're building your own, piece by piece. And once something is built that way, it doesn't disappear. It connects to other ideas. It becomes part of how you think, not just something you remember. But this method doesn't fit the system. It's too slow. It doesn't produce immediate results. You can't rush through chapters using it. You can't quickly memorize answers. It forces you to stop, to question, to rebuild. And in a system built on speed and standardization, that becomes a problem, so it gets replaced. Not officially. No one announces it. But gradually, the focus shifts. From understanding, performance. From thinking, recalling. From depth, speed. And over time, people forget this method even exists. They assume that struggling means they're not smart enough. That confusion means failure. That if something doesn't make sense quickly, they should just memorize it and move on. But the truth is the opposite. If something doesn't make sense, that's exactly where you should stop. Because that's where understanding begins. So once you understand the method, the real question becomes, why do some people actually use it, while others don't? Because knowing a method is not the same as applying it. Most people hear this and think, okay, I get it. I should understand, not memorize. And then they go right back to doing the same thing. faster, more efficiently, still avoiding the one thing that matters: slowing down. Real thinkers don't rush. That's the first difference. When they face something new, they don't try to finish it quickly. They try to see it clearly, and those are not the same goal. One is about completion, the other is about clarity. Here's the contrast. Most people measure progress by how much they've covered. Real thinkers measure progress by how much actually makes sense. That means they're willing to stay on one idea longer than everyone else, to sit with it, to turn it around from different angles, to question it until it becomes obvious. And that feels uncomfortable at first, because you've been trained to move forward, to finish chapters, to keep up. So when you slow down, it feels like you're falling behind. But in reality, you're doing something completely different. You're building depth, and depth changes how everything connects. Instead of isolated facts, you start seeing relationships. One idea explains another. One concept supports the next. Learning stops being a list of things to remember and becomes a system you can navigate. That's what real thinkers build. Not knowledge, structure. And once that structure exists, something interesting happens. You don't need to memorize as much anymore, because when you understand how something works, you can recreate it when needed. You don't rely on memory. You rely on reasoning. That's why they seem faster later. Not because they learned quickly, but because they understood deeply. There's another difference most people miss. Real thinkers constantly test their understanding, not by solving familiar problems, but by changing the situation. They ask, what if this was different? What if this condition changed? Would the same idea still work? That's how they know if something is real understanding or just pattern recognition. Because memorization breaks when the pattern changes. Understanding adapts. And this is where the method becomes powerful. You're no longer dependent on how something was taught. You're not limited to the exact form you learned it in. You can reshape it, apply it, extend it. That's thinking. But there's one more shift that matters. They don't fear confusion. They expect it. When something doesn't make sense, they don't move on. They stop. They go deeper. Because they know confusion is not a sign of failure. It's a signal that there's something to understand. Most people run from that signal. Real thinkers follow it. And that single difference changes everything. But here's the part most people never admit to themselves. Even after understanding all of this, they still won't change. Not because they can't, because their brain resists it. You see, the way you've been trained isn't just a habit. It's a comfort zone. Memorization feels safe. It gives you structure, clear steps, predictable outcomes. You know what to do, how to do it, and when you're done. Thinking doesn't give you that. Thinking puts you in uncertainty. You don't know if you're right. You don't know how long it will take. You don't even know if you're moving in the right direction. And your brain hates that feeling. It's wired to avoid it. So it pushes you back to what feels familiar, back to memorizing, back to shortcuts, back to quick answers. Here's the contrast. The average mind avoids discomfort. The thinking mind moves toward it. The average mind wants clarity immediately. The thinking mind builds it slowly. The average mind follows instructions. The thinking mind questions them. That difference is small at the beginning, but over time, it becomes everything. Because every time you avoid confusion, you stay the same. Every time you face it, you change. You build something deeper, stronger, more stable. But facing it requires something most people don't want to give: patience. Real thinking is slow, not because it's inefficient, but because it's precise. It doesn't skip steps. It doesn't pretend. It doesn't move forward until something actually makes sense. And in a world that rewards speed, that feels like falling behind, so people quit. They go back to what works in the short term, what gets results quickly, what looks like progress. And they convince themselves that this is enough. But deep down, something feels off. They know they don't fully understand. They know they're relying on patterns instead of reasoning. They know that if something changes, everything might fall apart. And instead of fixing that, they ignore it. Because fixing it means starting over, slowing down, admitting that what they thought they knew wasn't really understanding, and that's uncomfortable. But here's the truth. The moment you accept that discomfort, everything changes. You stop pretending. You stop rushing. You stop measuring yourself by how fast you move. And you start asking better questions. You start rebuilding your thinking from the ground up, not based on what you were told, but based on what actually makes sense to you. That's where real learning begins, not when you know more, when you refuse to accept what you don't understand. And most people will never reach that point, because it requires something rare, the willingness to be wrong, long enough to finally be right.